Marcus Thompson had seen combat in 3 different countries, survived ambushes that killed half his unit, and earned his Navy SEAL trident through some of the most brutal training on Earth. He thought he knew what real fighting looked like. He was wrong. Standing in a hospital corridor at 2:47 a.m., watching security footage of a 5'4" pediatric nurse named Sarah Chun take down 45 armed intruders with nothing but her bare hands and whatever she could grab, Marcus realized he had just witnessed something that would haunt military academies and self-defense instructors for decades to come. The attackers weren't street thugs or desperate addicts. They were trained mercenaries, each one carrying military-grade weapons, each one following a carefully planned assault on the children's cancer ward. And Sarah Chun had stopped them all. The question wasn't how she did it. The question was why no one saw it coming, and what kind of past creates a pediatric nurse who moves like death itself when children are threatened. Because as Marcus would soon discover, some people carry secrets that run deeper than any military file, and some protective instincts burn hotter than any training could ever teach. Sarah Chun moved through the pediatric cancer ward with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned that small sounds could wake a child fighting for their life. At 28, she had been working at St. Mary's Children's Hospital for 3 years, and the night shift had become her sanctuary. While the city slept, she watched over the most vulnerable patients, the ones whose immune systems were too weak for the chaos of daytime visitors and procedures. Tonight felt different, though she couldn't explain why. The October air carried an unusual chill through the sealed windows, and the hallway lights seemed to flicker more than usual. Sarah paused outside room 314, where 7-year-old Emma Rodriguez was sleeping fitfully after her latest round of chemotherapy. The little girl had been fighting leukemia for 18 months, and her parents had finally gone home to shower and rest after staying by her bedside for 3 straight days. Marcus Thompson sat in the security office 4 floors down, nursing his 3rd cup of coffee and trying to stay awake during what had been the most boring night of his civilian career. 6 months ago, he had been leading reconnaissance missions in Afghanistan. Now he was watching hospital corridors through a bank of monitors, making sure no one stole medical equipment or wandered into restricted areas. The transition from Navy SEAL to hospital security guard wasn't exactly what he had planned when he left the military, but after what happened to his unit in Kandahar, he needed something quiet. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had chosen one of the most peaceful jobs imaginable. St. Mary's was a good hospital in a safe neighborhood. The most excitement he had seen was a drunk driver who wandered into the emergency room and passed out in the waiting area. Marcus watched Sarah Chun appear on monitor 7 as she checked on another patient. She moved differently than the other nurses. He had noticed, more deliberately, with better spatial awareness. She reminded him of operators he had known, people who had been trained to notice everything while appearing to notice nothing. But that was impossible. According to her employment file, Sarah Chun was 28 years old, born in Sacramento, graduated nursing school at UC Davis, and had worked at 2 other hospitals before coming to St. Mary's. Nothing in her background suggested military training or combat experience. She was just a dedicated nurse who happened to move like she had been trained to kill people. Marcus shook his head and took another sip of coffee. He was seeing patterns where none existed, reading too much into the way someone walked. It was a common problem for veterans, especially those who had seen too much action. Everything looked like a potential threat when you had spent years in places where everything actually was a potential threat. On the 5th floor, Sarah finished checking on her patients and settled at the nurse's station to update charts. The ward was unusually quiet tonight. Usually, there were at least 2 or 3 children who couldn't sleep, calling for water or complaining about pain. But everyone seemed to be resting peacefully, which should have been a good thing. Instead, it made her nervous. She had learned to trust her instincts during the 3 years she couldn't talk about, the years that didn't appear on any resume or job application. Those instincts had kept her alive in places where mistakes meant death, and they were telling her something was wrong tonight. The problem was that she couldn't identify the threat. Everything appeared normal. The hospital was secured, the patients were stable, and the other staff members were going about their routines. But something felt off. At 11:47 p.m., she decided to do another security check of the ward. It wasn't part of her usual routine, but her instincts were rarely wrong. She walked the length of the corridor, checking that all the doors were properly locked, that the emergency exits showed green lights, that the medication room was secure. Everything appeared normal, but the feeling of wrongness only grew stronger. Marcus watched her on the monitors, noting how she moved during her security check. She wasn't just walking around randomly. She was conducting a systematic sweep, checking sight lines and egress routes the way someone would who had been trained in building security. But that couldn't be right. She was a nurse, not a security professional. At midnight, Sarah was updating medication schedules when she heard something that made her blood run cold. It was barely audible, just the faintest whisper of metal against metal coming from somewhere near the main elevator. Most people would have dismissed it as the normal settling sounds of an old building, but Sarah knew the difference between settling and stealth. She moved quietly to the corner of the corridor and listened carefully. There was again the soft sound of tools being used on metal, probably picks working on a lock. Someone was breaking into the building, and they were doing it professionally. This wasn't a random break-in or someone looking for drugs. This was planned, coordinated, and happening right now. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. The children's ward didn't contain drugs that would interest typical thieves. The most valuable items were medical equipment, but that would be easier to steal from storage areas during the day when there was more activity to mask the theft. Someone breaking in at midnight and taking the time to pick locks was here for something specific, or someone specific. Emma Rodriguez's father was testifying in a federal case next week. He had mentioned it to Sarah during one of their conversations while Emma slept. He was nervous about it, worried about leaving his daughter even for a few hours to give his testimony. Sarah had assumed it was a standard white-collar case, something involving his job as an accountant. But what if it was more serious? What if someone wanted to send him a message? The sound came again, closer this time. Multiple sources, at least 3 people, possibly more, working their way through the building's security systems. They were good at what they were doing, moving quietly and efficiently. But they had made one critical mistake. They assumed that a pediatric nurse wouldn't notice them, wouldn't recognize the sounds of a professional infiltration, and wouldn't know what to do about it. Sarah Chun had spent 3 years learning how to be invisible, how to move through hostile territory without being detected, and how to neutralize threats before they could hurt innocent people. Those skills had been buried deep when she chose to become a nurse, but they never really disappeared. They just waited patiently for the moment when they would be needed again. That moment had arrived. She moved to the nurse's station and picked up the phone to call security, but the line was dead. They had cut the communications. Next, she tried her cell phone, but there was no signal. They were using jammers, which meant this was definitely a professional operation. Hospital security wouldn't be able to help because hospital security wouldn't know anything was wrong until it was too late. Sarah looked down the corridor toward the rooms where 23 children were sleeping, trusting that the adults around them would keep them safe. Emma Rodriguez in 314, barely holding on after her latest treatment. Tommy Chun in 318, fighting brain cancer at age 5. Maria Santos in 322, who hadn't spoken since her diagnosis, but smiled every time Sarah brought her juice boxes. 23 children who couldn't run, couldn't fight, couldn't protect themselves. The elevator dinged softly, announcing the arrival of people who weren't supposed to be there. Sarah Chun took a deep breath, felt the familiar calm settle over her that she hadn't experienced in 3 years, and prepared to remember exactly who she used to be. Because sometimes when children are threatened and no one else can help, a pediatric nurse has to become something else entirely. The footsteps in the corridor were soft but audible now, at least 6 people moving with military precision toward the ward. Sarah estimated she had maybe 2 minutes before they reached the main entrance to the children's area. 2 minutes to become someone she had hoped never to be again. She moved quickly to the supply closet and gathered what she would need. surgical scissors, antiseptic spray, a bag of 4 fluid, rubber tubing, and a handful of other medical supplies that could serve dual purposes. Then, she went to the maintenance closet and added a few non-medical items to her collection. Finally, she went to each room where a child was sleeping and quietly engaged the individual door locks, buying them a few extra minutes of safety. The last thing she did was take off her nursing badge and ID card and place them carefully on the desk at the nurse's station. When this was over, if she survived it, Sarah Chun, the pediatric nurse, might not exist anymore. But 23 children would still be breathing, and that was what mattered. She could hear voices now, low and professional, discussing entry points and target locations. At least 8 people, possibly 10, all of them trained and armed. Under normal circumstances, it would be suicide for one person to engage that many opponents. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Sarah Chun wasn't a normal person. The ward's main door opened with the soft whisper of well-oiled hinges, and the first intruder stepped into the corridor. He was dressed in black tactical gear, carrying a suppressed submachine gun, and moving with the confidence of someone who expected no resistance. He had no idea that resistance was already watching him, already calculating angles and timing, already deciding exactly how he was going to die. Because in the next few minutes, Sarah Chun was going to remind 45 professional killers why some people choose to protect children and what happens to those who threaten them. The quiet pediatric nurse was about to disappear, and something much more dangerous was about to take her place. The first intruder never saw it coming. One moment he was scanning the seemingly empty corridor for threats, and the next moment Sarah Chun materialized beside him like smoke given form. The surgical scissors went into his neck with surgical precision, severing his carotid artery and vocal cords simultaneously. He died without making a sound, his weapon catching silently in her other hand before his body even hit the floor. Sarah dragged him into the supply closet and stripped him of ammunition and communication gear. Through his earpiece, she could hear the tactical chatter of the remaining attackers. They were professionals, speaking in clipped military terminology as they coordinated their assault. 8 more were already in the building, with additional teams securing the exits and monitoring communications. 45 total, just as Marcus would later count in the security footage. But they had made a critical error in their intelligence gathering. They knew about Emma Rodriguez and her father's upcoming testimony. They knew the hospital layout and security protocols. They even knew which room Emma was in and how many staff members were on duty tonight. What they didn't know was that one of those staff members had spent 3 years as a deep cover operative for a government agency that didn't officially exist, eliminating targets in places where conventional military forces couldn't operate. Sarah Chun had been very good at her job, good enough that when she finally burned out and walked away, her handlers let her disappear completely rather than risk losing her permanently. They had hoped she might come back someday, when she was ready. They never imagined she would surface as a pediatric nurse, dedicating her life to protecting the most vulnerable people in society. Now, as she moved through the darkened corridors like a ghost with a very specific purpose, Sarah remembered exactly why she had been one of the most effective operatives her agency had ever trained. It wasn't just her technical skills, though those were considerable. It was her ability to become absolutely ruthless when innocent lives were at stake. The second intruder was checking rooms systematically, looking for his target. Sarah let him find an empty room, then followed him inside. She used the rubber 4 tubing as a garrote, cutting off his air supply, while using his body to muffle any sounds. When he stopped struggling, she took his weapon and grenades, adding them to her growing arsenal. Through the stolen earpiece, she heard the team leader's voice. Bravo 2, report status. She keyed the microphone and spoke in the dead man's voice, a skill that had taken months to perfect but never really faded. Corridor secure. Continuing sweep. Copy that. Remember, we need the girl alive until her father sees what happens when people testify against our employer. Make it slow, make it visible, then clean up and extract. Sarah's blood turned to ice. This wasn't just about silencing a witness. They wanted to torture a 7-year-old child to send a message to her father. Emma Rodriguez, who was already fighting for her life against leukemia, was going to be murdered slowly while someone filmed it to break her father's spirit. The cold, operational calm that had carried Sarah through 3 years of wet work crystallized into something much more dangerous. Maternal fury weaponized by professional training. She had spent the last 3 years caring for children like Emma, watching them fight battles that would break grown men, marveling at their courage and resilience. The idea of someone deliberately harming one of them triggered something primal and merciless in her psyche. She began hunting in earnest. The third and fourth intruders died within seconds of each other in the medication storage room. Sarah had rigged a simple trap using antiseptic spray and a spark from damaged electrical wiring. The improvised flamethrower caught them both before they could react, and she finished them with their own weapons while they were still burning. "Bravo team, we have a fire in Sector 7, came the report over the radio. "Probably hit a gas line," the team leader replied. "Work around it." "Charlie team, what's your status on the target?" "Still searching, sir. She's not in the first room we checked." Sarah smiled grimly. Emma Rodriguez was in room 314, but Sarah had quietly moved her to room 320 an hour before the attack began, following an instinct she couldn't have explained at the time. Little Emma was now sleeping peacefully behind a locked door that looked like an empty room from the outside, unaware that people were hunting her. The fifth intruder found the bodies in the medication room and immediately called for backup. Sarah was waiting in the ceiling above him, having climbed up through a maintenance access panel. She dropped down behind him and used her knowledge of anatomy to paralyze him instantly with pressure applied to specific nerve clusters. He lived long enough to tell her everything he knew about the operation before she ended his suffering. 45 total operatives. Escape routes covered. Communications jammed. Local police response delayed by false emergency calls across the city. This wasn't a simple assassination. It was a military-style operation designed to send a message to anyone who might consider testifying against their employer. But they had overlooked one crucial detail. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the building isn't the one you're looking for. Sometimes it's the one you never notice, the one who blends into the background so perfectly that you forget they exist until it's too late. Sarah made her way toward the main group of attackers, who were systematically searching rooms and growing increasingly frustrated by their failure to find their target. She could hear their tension mounting in their radio chatter. They were on a tight timeline, and nothing was going according to plan. She found 6 of them clustered around the nurse's station, studying the patient roster and trying to determine which rooms to check next. Sarah watched them for 30 seconds, memorizing their positions and calculating angles of attack. Then, she introduced herself. The first grenade rolled across the floor like a metallic egg, coming to rest directly beneath their improvised command post. The explosion shattered the windows and sent medical equipment flying like shrapnel. 3 of the 6 died instantly. The other 3 were wounded but still combat effective, which was exactly what Sarah had planned. She wanted them functional enough to be afraid. The wounded survivors took cover behind an overturned desk and returned fire toward where they thought the grenade had come from. But Sarah was already moving, using the smoke and chaos to position herself behind them. She killed 2 with knife work that was both silent and efficient, leaving the third man alive long enough to report to his teammates. "This is Bravo 7. We're under attack. Multiple casualties. Someone in here knows what they're doing." "Impossible," came the team leader's voice. "Hospital security is neutralized, and the staff are all accounted for. Well, someone just killed half my team with military precision. This isn't some rent-a-cop or panicking nurse." Sarah let him live a few more seconds to spread fear among the remaining attackers, then ended his transmission permanently. Fear was a weapon she had learned to use expertly. Panicked enemies made mistakes, and mistakes in this business were usually fatal. Through the stolen radio, She listened as the remaining teams reorganized and began searching for her instead of their original target. Good. Let them hunt her instead of hunting Emma Rodriguez. Sarah knew this building better than they did, and she had advantages they couldn't possibly anticipate. She made her way to the generator room in the basement, taking out 3 more operatives along the way. Each kill was clean, efficient, and designed to maximize psychological impact on their teammates. By the time she reached the electrical systems, the surviving attackers were openly discussing retreat options. But Sarah wasn't going to let them retreat. They had come here to torture and murder a 7-year-old child. That wasn't the kind of crime you walked away from, not if Sarah Chun had anything to say about it. She cut the main power to the building, plunging everything into emergency lighting. Then, she began systematically hunting the remaining operatives through corridors they no longer understood, in darkness that favored her over them. The next phase of the battle would be fought on her terms, in her territory, with her rules. And her rules were very simple. Anyone who threatened children in her care would not be leaving this building alive. 28 down, 17 to go. The emergency lighting cast long shadows through the corridors, and in those shadows, Sarah Chun moved like death itself, protecting the children who slept peacefully in their beds, unaware that someone who loved them was fighting a war to keep them safe. Because some things are worth killing for, and some people are worth dying for, and tonight Sarah Chun was going to prove that the most dangerous person in any building isn't the one carrying the biggest gun. It's the one with the most to lose and the skills to do something about it. The hunt continued, and mercy was not on the menu. Marcus Thompson was reviewing security footage from the previous day when every monitor in his control room went black simultaneously. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, bathing everything in an eerie red glow that reminded him uncomfortably of his last night in Afghanistan. His first instinct was to check the backup generators, but before he could move, his radio crackled to life. Security to all stations. We have a complete power failure. Switching to backup systems and investigating cause. Marcus grabbed his radio and portable equipment, then headed for the stairs. Something was very wrong, and his gut told him it wasn't a simple electrical failure. In his experience, when things went dark, it usually meant someone wanted them dark. As he climbed toward the pediatric ward, he began hearing sounds that didn't belong in a hospital. Muffled explosions, brief bursts of automatic gunfire, and the kind of tactical radio chatter he recognized from combat zones. Sarah Chun had become a ghost in her own workplace. The emergency lighting created pools of blood-red illumination connected by corridors of absolute darkness, and she used both to her advantage. She knew every inch of these floors, every hiding place and sightline, every maintenance access and emergency exit. The remaining 17 intruders were operating blind in a building that was actively hunting them. She found 4 of them trying to breach the door to the pharmacy, apparently hoping to create a diversion by starting a drug fire. Sarah watched them work for nearly a minute, studying their technique and coordination. They were good, but they were also focused on their task to the exclusion of their surroundings. Amateur mistake in a hostile environment. The first man died when Sarah stepped out of the darkness and put a knife under his ribs, angling up toward his heart with the precision of someone who had studied anatomy extensively. She caught his body as it fell, lowering it silently to prevent noise that might alert his teammates. The second man turned to check on his partner and found Sarah wearing his friend's tactical vest and radio headset. "Status report," she whispered in the dead man's voice. "Charges set, ready to blow on your signal," he replied, not recognizing that he was talking to his own death. Sarah nodded and triggered the explosive charges herself, but not before grabbing the man and throwing both of them clear of the blast. The explosion killed the remaining 2 operatives and scattered pharmaceutical supplies across the corridor, but Sarah and her unwilling human shield survived the blast intact. She interrogated the survivor quickly and efficiently, using techniques that would have impressed her former handlers. He told her everything: The operation was being run by Viktor Kozlov, a Russian oligarch whose money laundering operation was about to be exposed by Emma Rodriguez's father. Kozlov had decided that making an example of Rodriguez's family would be more effective than simply killing the accountant. Terror was always more persuasive than mere death. When she had extracted all useful information, Sarah ended the man's life quickly. She wasn't cruel, just thorough. 13 operatives remaining, plus Kozlov himself, who was coordinating from a command vehicle outside the hospital. But Sarah's immediate concern was the 5-man team that had finally located Emma Rodriguez's room. She could hear them through the stolen radio as they prepared to breach the door to room 314, expecting to find a 6-7-year-old girl sleeping peacefully in her bed. Instead, they would find an empty room and evidence that someone had anticipated their arrival. That would buy Emma a few more minutes of safety, but not many. Sarah made her way toward room 320, where Emma was actually hidden, moving through maintenance passages and air ducts she had mapped during her 3 years working in the hospital. She emerged in the room across the hall and watched through a crack in the door as 5 armed men gathered around the entrance to room 314. The team leader spoke quietly into his radio, "Breaching target room now. Prepare for live transmission to subject's father." Sarah's blood ran cold. They weren't just planning to kill Emma Rodriguez. They were going to torture her slowly while forcing her father to watch, probably streaming the video live to wherever he was being held. It was a level of cruelty that went beyond professional necessity into pure sadism. She waited until they had breached the door and discovered the empty room before making her move. The confusion and argument that followed gave her the opening she needed. Sarah emerged from the shadows like an avenging angel, moving with speed and precision that seemed almost supernatural in the dim emergency lighting. The first operative died before he knew she was there, a throwing knife appearing in his throat as if by magic. The second spun toward the sound of his teammate's death and caught a scalpel in his eye, driven deep enough to reach his brain. The third managed to raise his weapon before Sarah closed the distance and broke his neck with a single efficient twist. The fourth operative got off a burst of automatic fire, but he was shooting at shadows and echoes while Sarah attacked from an impossible angle, having used the wall and ceiling to position herself above him. He died confused and afraid, still trying to understand how someone could move like water and strike like lightning. The fifth man was the team leader, and he was good enough to actually track Sarah's movement and get his weapon pointed in the right direction. Under normal circumstances, he might have been fast enough to matter. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Sarachin wasn't bound by normal human limitations when children were at risk. She disarmed him with a move that left 3 of his fingers broken and his wrist shattered, then pinned him against the wall with pressure that made it difficult to breathe. He was going to tell her everything about Kozlov's operation, including where Emma's father was being held and how many more people were involved in this nightmare. "Please," he gasped, looking in her eyes and seeing something that made him understand exactly how much trouble he was in. "I have children too." "Then you should understand why this is personal," Sarah replied, applying pressure to a nerve cluster that caused excruciating pain without permanent damage. "Your boss made a mistake when he decided to target mine." Marcus Thompson reached the 5th floor just as Sarah finished her interrogation of the team leader. He had been following the sounds of combat through the building, trying to understand what was happening and who was responsible. His military training told him this was a coordinated assault by professional operatives, but someone was systematically dismantling them with skills that matched or exceeded their own. He crept down the corridor toward the children's ward, moving with the stealth and caution that had kept him alive through multiple tours in hostile territory. As he approached the nurse's station, he could see bodies scattered throughout the area, all of them dressed in black tactical gear and carrying military-grade weapons. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't a simple break-in. Then he saw her. Sarah Chun stood in the corridor outside room 314, calmly reloading a weapon she had taken from one of the dead operatives. She was covered in blood that wasn't her own, her nurse's uniform torn, but her movements still fluid and precise. She looked like someone who had been trained to kill professionally and was very good at her job. Marcus recognized the signs immediately. The way she held the weapon, her situational awareness, the efficiency of her movements. She was military or intelligence, probably special operations based on her skill level. But, according to her personnel file, she was just a nurse with no combat training or military background. "Sarah," he called quietly, not wanting to startle someone who was clearly in a combat mindset. She spun toward him with inhuman speed, the weapon tracking toward his center mass before stopping as she recognized his voice. For just a moment, Marcus found himself staring down the barrel of an assault rifle held by someone who knew exactly how to use it. "Marcus," she said, lowering the weapon but not relaxing her guard. "What are you doing here?" "My job," he replied, studying her face and seeing something that reminded him of operators he had known in Afghanistan. "Though it looks like you're doing it better than I am. How many of them are left?" Sarah paused, listening to radio chatter through the stolen earpiece. 8 inside the building, plus their boss outside in a command vehicle. They came here to torture and murder Emma Rodriguez to send a message to her father. Emma Rodriguez? The little girl with leukemia? Her father is testifying in a federal case against a Russian money launderer. They thought terrorizing his daughter would be more effective than just killing him. Sarah's voice carried the kind of cold anger that Marcus recognized from soldiers who had seen too much of what people could do to each other. "Where is Emma now?" "Safe. I moved her before they arrived." Sarah checked her weapon and prepared to move deeper into the building. "I'm going to finish this, Marcus. These people don't get to walk away from what they try to do." Marcus studied her face in the emergency lighting and made a decision that would change both their lives. "I'm coming with you. This isn't your fight. Anyone who threatens children in this hospital makes it my fight. Besides," he added with a grim smile, "you look like you could use backup." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, evaluating his capabilities and commitment. She saw something in his eyes that convinced her he wasn't just playing hero. He was military, probably special forces, and he understood what they were facing. "Stay close, follow my lead, and don't hesitate," she said, handing him one of the captured weapons. "We're going hunting." Together, they disappeared into the darkened corridors of the hospital, 2 predators stalking prey that had made the fatal mistake of threatening innocent children. The remaining 8 operatives had no idea what was coming for them, but they were about to learn why some people choose to dedicate their lives to protecting others and what happens to those who threaten the defenseless. The darkness that had been the intruder's ally was about to become their tomb. Sarah Chun and Marcus Thompson were going to make sure of it. Marcus Thompson discovered that fighting alongside Sarah Chun was like partnering with a force of nature. She moved through the darkened hospital corridors with an intuitive understanding of combat flow that reminded him of his most experienced teammates in Afghanistan, but with an added dimension of protective fury that made her absolutely terrifying to face. They found the next group of operatives trying to establish a defensive position in the main lobby, using overturned furniture and medical equipment as improvised barricades. 6 men with automatic weapons and training positioned to control all the major exit routes from the building. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a nearly impregnable position. Sarah studied their setup for 30 seconds, then turned to Marcus with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Remember the Mosul hospital clearing we talked about?" she asked, though they had never discussed any such thing. Marcus looked at her in confusion for a moment, then understood. She was giving him a reference point, assuming he would adapt to whatever plan she had in mind. It was the kind of field improvisation that only worked between operators who trusted each other's capabilities completely. "Cover me for 40 seconds, then create a distraction at the south entrance," she said, checking her remaining ammunition. "When they reposition to respond to your noise, I'll take them from behind." "What kind of distraction?" "Loud, bright, and threatening. Make them think a SWAT team is breaching." She handed him 2 grenades from her collection of captured equipment. "Can you handle that?" Marcus nodded, recognizing the tactical soundness of her plan. It was simple, direct, and played to both their strengths. More importantly, it was the kind of coordination that could only work between people who had been trained to think tactically under pressure. Sarah disappeared into the shadows like smoke, moving through maintenance areas and service corridors that the operatives hadn't thought to secure. Marcus gave her the requested 40 seconds, then announced his presence with a bang. The first grenade detonated near the south entrance, followed immediately by Marcus opening fire with controlled bursts from two different positions, making it sound like multiple shooters were breaching the building. The operatives reacted exactly as Sarah had predicted, repositioning their defensive line to meet the apparent threat from the south. That was when Sarah struck from the north, emerging from an access panel behind their new position like a ghost materializing from solid matter. She moved through them with surgical precision, using knife work and close-quarters combat techniques that were both silent and absolutely lethal. By the time Marcus stopped shooting and the echoes faded, 6 more operatives were dead, and their defensive position had become their tomb. Jesus Christ, Marcus whispered as he joined her among the bodies. Where did you learn to move like that? Places that don't exist on any map, Sarah replied, searching the dead men for intelligence. Working for people who don't officially exist either. She found what she was looking for in the team leader's equipment, a tablet computer showing the layout of their entire operation. Kozlov wasn't just running this assault from a command vehicle outside the hospital. He had positioned backup teams at Emma Rodriguez's home, her school, and her grandparents' house. Even if the primary assault failed, he had contingency plans to complete his message of terror. Marcus, look at this, she said, showing him the tactical display. This is bigger than just tonight. He's got people positioned to hit her family no matter where they run. Marcus studied the display, recognizing the sophistication of the operation. This is military-level planning and coordination. How many people are we talking about? 37 more operatives spread across 5 locations, plus Kozlov himself. Sarah's voice carried the weight of someone calculating odds that didn't look favorable. And Emma's father is being held in a warehouse downtown, forced to watch a live feed of everything that's supposed to happen to his daughter. We need to call in federal backup. FBI, ATF, someone with the resources to handle an operation this size. Sarah shook her head. Kozlov has been monitoring emergency frequencies all night. The moment we make contact with law enforcement, he'll execute Emma's father and activate all his contingency teams. By the time federal agents mobilize, the entire Rodriguez family will be dead. Marcus felt the familiar weight of an impossible decision settling on his shoulders. It was the kind of situation he had faced multiple times in Afghanistan, where calling for backup meant escalating a bad situation into a catastrophe, but going it alone meant accepting odds that no reasonable person would take. So what's the plan? He asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. We finish what we started here. Then we go get Emma's father before Kozlov realizes his assault team is dead. Sarah checked her captured weapons and equipment, making the kind of practical preparations that soldiers made before walking into certain death. 2 people against 37 isn't good odds, but it's the only play we have. 2 people against 39, Marcus corrected. You're forgetting about Kozlov and his personal security. I'm not forgetting about him. I'm saving him for last. There was something in Sarah's voice when she mentioned Kozlov that made Marcus understand this had become personal for her. It wasn't just about stopping a criminal operation or protecting one family. Someone had threatened children in her care, and that had awakened something primal and unforgiving in her psyche. They found the last 2 operatives in the building trying to plant explosive charges in the basement, apparently planning to bring down the entire pediatric wing if their primary mission failed. Sarah and Marcus hit them simultaneously from opposite directions, eliminating both threats before either man could trigger their devices. Bastards, Marcus muttered, disarming the explosives with hands that shook slightly from rage. They were going to murder every child in the building. Kozlov doesn't believe in half measures, Sarah replied, though her voice carried the same barely controlled fury. He wanted to make sure Emma Rodriguez's death would be memorable, even if it meant killing dozens of innocent children as collateral damage. With the building secured and all 45 operatives eliminated, they made their way toward Kozlov's command vehicle. Through the stolen radios, they could hear increasing panic in the communications as the Russian realized that his entire assault team had gone silent. All teams, report status immediately. Kozlov's voice carried a distinct Russian accent and growing desperation. Sarah keyed the radio and spoke in the voice of one of his dead operatives. "Sir, we have the target secured and ready for transmission. Request confirmation of father's location for video link-up. Warehouse District, Pier 17. Are you certain the girl is secure? I'm showing no communication from half your teams. Technical difficulties with the communications equipment, sir. We'll have the video feed established within 10 minutes. Excellent. Make sure the father sees everything clearly before you finish her. I want him to understand the consequences of betraying Viktor Kozlov." Sarah met Marcus's eyes, and he saw something there that reminded him why he had become a soldier in the first place. Some people dedicated their lives to protecting others, and some people preyed on the innocent. Tonight was going to determine which philosophy prevailed. "Pier 17, Marcus said quietly. "I know where that is. 15-minute drive if we push it." "Then let's go finish this," Sarah replied, though she paused first to check on Emma Rodriguez one final time. The little girl was still sleeping peacefully in room 320, unaware that people had died tonight to keep her safe. Sarah touched her forehead gently, the simple gesture of someone who understood that some things were worth dying for. Then she and Marcus made their way toward the parking garage, two warriors preparing for what might be their final battle. Kozlov was waiting at Pier 17 with 37 armed operatives and no idea that death was coming for him in the form of a pediatric nurse and a former Navy SEAL who had decided that protecting children was worth any risk. The final confrontation was about to begin, and mercy was still not on the menu. The warehouse at Pier 17 looked like a fortress in the pre-dawn darkness. Kozlov had chosen his location well, an isolated industrial building surrounded by open ground, with multiple escape routes by land and water. Floodlights illuminated the perimeter, and Marcus counted at least 20 operatives in visible positions around the building. The rest would be inside, along with Emma Rodriguez's father and the man responsible for orchestrating this nightmare. Sarah Chun studied the facility through stolen night vision equipment, her mind automatically calculating fields of fire, cover positions, and approach routes. It was a tactical puzzle that would have challenged an entire special operations team, let alone two people with limited ammunition and no backup. "This is insane," Marcus said quietly, though his voice carried resignation rather than fear. "Even if we somehow get inside without being detected, we still have to locate the father, neutralize Kozlov, and fight our way out against overwhelming odds." "I've done worse," Sarah replied, and something in her voice made Marcus believe her. She had been studying the tactical display from the capture tablet, memorizing the layout and identifying weak points in their defensive perimeter. Kozlov had made one critical mistake in his fortress mentality. He had positioned his forces to repel an assault from ground level, but he hadn't adequately secured the approaches from above. "There," she said, pointing to a maintenance crane that serviced the shipping containers near the warehouse. "We can use that to get onto the roof, then work our way down through the building. They'll be watching the doors and windows, not the ceiling." Marcus studied her proposed route and nodded slowly. It was dangerous and required skills he wasn't sure he possessed, but it was also the only approach that offered any realistic chance of success. "You really think we can pull this off?" "Marcus, 6 hours ago, I was a pediatric nurse updating medication charts. Now I've killed 45 people to protect one sick little girl." Sarah checked her weapons one final time, her movements carrying the mechanical precision of someone preparing for war. "I stopped worrying about what I think I can do and started focusing on what needs to be done." They made their approach from the water side of the facility, using the darkness and industrial noise to mask their movement. The crane was exactly where Sarah had spotted it on the tactical display, a massive piece of equipment that stretched high enough to overlook the warehouse roof. Getting to the top required climbing skills that pushed Marcus to his limits, but Sarah moved up the steel framework like she had been born to it. From their elevated position, they could see into the warehouse through skylights and ventilation openings. Emma Rodriguez's father was bound to a chair in the center of the main floor, facing a large video screen that was currently displaying static. Kozlov stood nearby with a laptop computer, apparently waiting for the video feed from his assault team that would never come. 18 operatives inside, Sarah counted, studying the building's layout, plus Kozlov and what looks like 2 personal bodyguards. They're positioned to control all the ground-level entrances, but they've left the upper levels relatively unguarded. How do we get down there without starting a firefight that gets the father killed? Sarah smiled, though there was no warmth in the expression. We don't avoid the firefight. We control it. She produced several items from her collection of captured equipment, including smoke grenades, flashbang devices, and what appeared to be military-grade explosive charges. Marcus realized she had been planning this assault from the moment they found the tactical display, thinking 3 moves ahead while he was still trying to process what they were facing. I'm going to create chaos throughout the building, force them to spread out, and react to multiple threats, she explained, attaching ropes to the crane for rapid descent. You rappel down to the main floor, grab the father, and get him to safety. Once he's clear, I'll deal with Kozlov personally. What about the 20-plus operatives who'll be shooting at us? I'll handle them. Sarah's voice carried the kind of absolute certainty that came from someone who had faced impossible odds before and survived. Marcus, these people came to torture and murder a 7-year-old child to send a message. They forfeited their right to mercy the moment they walked into that hospital. Marcus looked into her eyes and saw something that reminded him of the most dangerous operators he had known in Afghanistan, people who had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed and found peace with the consequences. Sarah Chun had become something more than a nurse tonight, something that existed to protect the innocent by eliminating those who threatened them. Give me 3 minutes to get into position, she said, preparing for her descent. When you hear the first explosion, that's your signal to move. Sarah disappeared over the edge of the building like a shadow, given purpose, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and the weight of what they were about to attempt. He had been in similar situations in Afghanistan, but never with stakes this personal and never with a partner whose capabilities he was only beginning to understand. 3 minutes later, the warehouse erupted into chaos. The first explosion came from the east side of the building, followed immediately by automatic gunfire and shouts of confusion from Kozlov's operatives. Then, the lights went out as Sarah cut the main power, plunging everything into emergency lighting that cast long shadows throughout the facility. More explosions followed in rapid succession, each one from a different location, creating the impression of a coordinated assault by multiple teams. Marcus could hear Kozlov screaming orders in Russian, while his operatives scrambled to respond to threats that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. Marcus rappelled down through a skylight in the center of the chaos, landing near where Emma's father was bound to his chair. The man looked up with eyes wide with terror and hope, recognizing that someone was trying to rescue him, but not understanding how or why. I'm hospital security, Marcus said quickly, cutting the ropes that bound him. Sarah Chun sent me to get you out of here. Sarah? The nurse from Emma's ward? How did she? Long story. We need to move now. They made it halfway to the exit before Kozlov spotted them and opened fire with a pistol, forcing Marcus to drag Emma's father behind a concrete pillar for cover. More operatives converged on their position, trapping them in the center of the warehouse with no clear escape route. That was when Sarah Chun revealed the full extent of her capabilities. She appeared from above like an avenging angel, dropping through another skylight with weapons in both hands and moving with a fluid grace that seemed to defy physics. She landed among Kozlov's operatives like a force of nature, eliminating 3 of them before they even realized she was there. What followed was the most impressive display of close-quarters combat Marcus had ever witnessed. Sarah moved through the warehouse like water flowing around obstacles, never staying in one place long enough for anyone to draw a bead on her, always attacking from angles that her opponents couldn't predict or counter. She used the environment to her advantage, turning industrial equipment into weapons and cover positions into death traps. When she ran out of ammunition, she switched to knife work that was both beautiful and terrifying to watch. When she lost her knives, she used improvised weapons created from whatever was within reach. One by one, Kozlov's operatives fell to someone who fought like she had been trained by the best military instructors in the world and refined her skills in places where mistakes meant death. It wasn't just her technical proficiency that made her so effective. It was her absolute commitment to the mission and her willingness to accept any personal cost to complete it. Marcus used the distraction Sarah created to get Emma's father to safety, but he couldn't resist watching as she systematically dismantled Kozlov's remaining forces. She was everything he had aspired to be as a Navy SEAL, someone who had transformed protective instincts into lethal capability and dedicated both to serving others. When the last of Kozlov's operatives fell, Sarah turned her attention to the man himself. He had taken cover behind his computer equipment and was frantically trying to contact his backup teams, apparently hoping they could still salvage something from the disaster his operation had become. "Victor Kozlov," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the warehouse with absolute authority. "You came to my hospital to torture children. That was a mistake. You have no idea who you're dealing with," Kozlov replied, though his voice shook with fear and rage. "I have resources, connections, people who will hunt you down and make you pay for what you've done tonight." "No," Sarah said simply, walking toward him with the steady pace of someone who had already decided how this conversation would end. "You had those things. Now you have about 30 seconds to make peace with whatever God you believe in." Kozlov raised his pistol and fired twice, both shots aimed center mass at Sarah's approaching form. She moved aside with minimal effort, the bullets passing harmlessly through space she no longer occupied. Her return shot was placed with surgical precision, shattering his wrist and sending the weapon spinning away into the darkness. 20 seconds, she said, continuing her approach. "Please," Kozlov gasped, clutching his wounded hand. "I can pay you anything you want. Money, information, whatever you need." "What I need," Sarah replied, "is for people like you to understand that children are not acceptable targets, ever for any reason. Consider this a lesson for anyone else who might have similar ideas." The final shot echoed through the warehouse like a period at the end of a sentence, bringing Victor Kozlov's reign of terror to a definitive close. Sarah stood over his body for a moment, ensuring that the threat was truly ended, then turned to help Marcus and Emma's father. "Is it over?" the man asked, looking around at the carnage that surrounded them. "It's over," Sarah confirmed, though she was already thinking about cleanup and consequences. "Your daughter is safe, your family is protected, and the people responsible for threatening them will never hurt anyone again." As they made their way out of the warehouse, Marcus found himself studying Sarah Chun with new understanding. She had revealed capabilities tonight that went far beyond anything in her official background, skills that suggested a past filled with violence and secrets. But she had used those skills to protect innocent people, dedicating deadly capabilities to the service of healing and protection. "So what happens now?" he asked as they walked toward their vehicle. "Now we go back to the hospital," Sarah replied, her voice already returning to the calm professionalism he remembered from her work as a pediatric nurse. "Emma Rodriguez needs her medication updated, and I have 17 other patients who are counting on me to take care of them. And everything that happened tonight?" Sarah smiled, though there was sadness in the expression. "Tonight was about protecting children who couldn't protect themselves. Everything else is just details." Marcus realized that Sarah Chun was exactly who she appeared to be, a pediatric nurse dedicated to caring for sick children. The fact that she was also capable of eliminating 45 professional killers when those children were threatened didn't change her essential nature. It just made her the most dangerous nurse in medical history. As they drove back towards St. Mary's Children's Hospital, Marcus understood that he had witnessed something extraordinary. He had seen what happened when someone with the skills to wage war chose instead to dedicate their life to healing, and what occurred when that choice was threatened by people who preyed on the innocent. Sarah Chun had proven that the most dangerous person in any situation isn't always the one you expect. Sometimes it's the one who has the most to protect and the skills to do whatever protection requires. And sometimes late at night in a children's hospital, that's exactly the person you want watching over the most vulnerable members of society.